In this video, we will have a look at the topic of livestock and greenhouse gas emissions. The intention is to show that this conversation is all too often imbalanced, while we will offer 10 arguments for more nuance. Much more information and details, and all scientific references in support of the statements can be found on the Aleph 2020 website. Reducing the emissions from livestock is an important challenge to the food system. That said, this does not imply, as sometimes suggested by those with anti-farming agendas, that all of animal production needs to be drastically downscaled, or worse, abolished. Let's be clear, future food systems will still require herds of animals that need to be large enough to feed a growing population. It is overly simplistic and potentially counterproductive to assume that we would need to generalize vegetarianism, or that entire population groups would need to restrict meat and dairy consumption to very small amounts. This statement on the website of the United Nations Environment Programme, claiming that meat is the world's most urgent problem, is an example of how much misinformation circulates, even at the highest levels. Or take this, coming from Oxford University, quoting two of its researchers who are suggesting that we should all turn vegan to beat climate change, because it is said to be the single biggest way to reduce our impact on the planet. Or this highly emotive and hyperbolic statement by The Economist, by cooking so many cows, humans are cooking themselves. Forgoing steaks may be one of the most efficient ways to reduce our carbon footprint. It's a dangerous distraction from the real issue. Since 2021, this message has been posted repeatedly on social media by The Economist, in what looks more like a PR campaign than normal journalistic behavior. Depending on the study, the food system contributes between 1/5 to 1/3 of the human-caused output of greenhouse gases. About 40% of that is caused by agriculture and fisheries as such, while global supply chains, as well as land use and land use change, each contribute around 30%. Due to the higher emissions associated with foods from animal origin compared to plants, dietary policies often focus on the former. The livestock sector indeed bears a substantial responsibility for climate impact and emission budgets. While some advocate for plant-based eating as a means to reduce climate impact, reality is more nuanced. Comparing single foods from animal or plant origin is not at all straightforward. All too often, this is done in a misleading manner. Each dietary change has both positive and negative effects. A better approach is to contrast wholesome dietary patterns and to evaluate the broader ecological, nutritional, and societal trade-offs. In any case, when attempting sustainable dietary transitions, it is key that the common pitfall of carbon tunnel vision needs to be avoided. Gains in climate impact reduction can potentially lead to trade-offs related to other variables that are affected by the complex process of agricultural change, such as increased water scarcity footprints, worsened biodiversity, increased ecotoxicity, or various manifestations of social harm. Argument 1. Livestock's contribution to global anthropogenic emissions has been estimated at 12%, based on the latest data from the Food and Agricultural Organization. However, emission intensities vary worldwide, and global data do not necessarily reflect local contexts. When assessing the climate impact of livestock, they should not be extrapolated within a given region or production system. Factors like feed digestibility, genetics, climate conditions, and management practices give rise to a lot of variability. Many regional differences in factors like wealth, draft power, fuel, and religious significance also contribute to differences in emission intensities. As can be seen from the following two graphs, there are not only substantial differences in the total emissions that can be ascribed to livestock locally, but also in production efficiency, complicating any generalization at the local level. However, this also illustrates that there is still a lot of low-hanging fruit to decrease emissions from a global perspective. This brings us to argument 2. The case against livestock assumes status quo. It thereby fails to consider the potential for improvement, which is still substantial. Feed optimization, veterinary care, smart manure utilization, better herd management, and various other strategies could lead to meaningful reductions in future carbon intensities. Biogas valorization, improved integration with crop agriculture, reducing food wastage, reusing byproducts, and increasing the consumption of organ meats are additional mitigation options. In its strategic vision document, Pathways Towards Lower Emissions, the FAO claims that successful mitigation of emissions by mid-century is indeed possible, based on a series of cumulative interventions. Also, it notes that the effects of dietary change are modest and not the game changer that some claim it to be, which takes us to the next argument. Argument 3. If we were to decide that animal source foods need to be taken out of our diets, this would create a food gap, requiring higher crop production to meet nutritional needs and to compensate for the lost nutrients. What is often overlooked is that this would generate its own emissions. The potential gain can therefore not be seen as a simple elimination of the current global emissions by livestock, now estimated at 12%, but should factor in increased crop-driven emissions. In addition, gains of 50% or more within the dietary compartment of the carbon footprint should not be confused with the much smaller gains within one's total footprint. Net gains from dietary transitions would thus be a lot smaller than often assumed. For instance, and to put this in perspective, removing all livestock in the United States may lead to just 3% reduction in national emissions, and removing all dairy would result in a mere 1% reduction while creating nutrient security concerns. In the world's high-income countries, adopting plant-based diets would result in a small reduction of one's total carbon footprint, likely somewhere between 1 and 6%. This would only be meaningful if the diet is sustained, which is seldom the case. Few vegans and even vegetarians remain committed to the diet for longer periods, after which they revert to omnivorous food choices. In this figure, you can see how the dietary emissions in Western countries are usually situated between 1.5 and 2.3 tons of CO2 per person per year. This is on a total carbon footprint of 8 to 15 tons per year, depending on the country. As depicted in this document, coming from the British House of Lords, some have suggested that global citizens should live and eat like Indians or Indonesians. This, of course, is not only unrealistic, but it would also imply a serious drop in welfare. Have in mind that about 1/3 of the very young children in India are stunted and that malnourishment is rampant. To illustrate all of this, let's take the case of France, a total carbon footprint of about 12 tons, in which we can find a dietary compartment of 2 tons. If a Frenchman would go vegan, this may save him 0.8 tons of CO2, or about 6% on his total footprint. Vegetarianism would maybe result in 4%, and going flexitarian about 2%. That's not nothing, but it is not much, and it should be valued as such. It is important to note how all these efforts are ultimately negated by more intensive lifestyle choices. Going on a holiday by plane may easily undo several years of plant-based eating. Let's build further on these findings while advancing argument 4. Matters of diet seem to be elbowing some of the more pertinent topics out of climate change discourse. However, as we've just seen, A shift to plant-based diets would only save a modest amount of carbon. Tourism, digitalization, keeping pets and fashion all contribute to global greenhouse gas emissions, but these aspects of Western lifestyles receive a lot less attention than dietary choices. Livestock serve as convenient scapegoats. Ultimately, a small minority generates most global emissions. It has been estimated that the average personal consumption emissions from a sample of prominent billionaires amounts to no less than 8,000 tons of CO2 per person per year. Compare this to the 10 tons of emissions per person per year for an average individual in a high-income country, or to the even much lower impact in the global south. Talk show celebrity Oprah told her fan base that a vegan meal a day corresponds with driving from LA to New York. Her personal air travels equaled no less than 40 times the total yearly emission of average Americans. Private jet users generate up to 7,500 tons of carbon dioxide per year, while super yachts lead to 4,500 tons. For space tourism, increasingly popular among billionaires, emissions per flight represent 50 to 100 times the emissions of a regular long-haul airplane flight. Billionaires like Richard Branson, who invest in vegan food tech and have accumulated their wealth based on fossil fuel-intensive activities, do not only spread false information. The hypocrisy of their position is extraordinary. Argument 5. Dietary policies aimed at reducing emissions should never be nutritionally harmful or incomplete. Some foods and beverages with higher carbon footprints offer important nutritional value, which partially offsets their environmental impact. It is important to bear in mind that the main nutritional challenges in the global food system are not all that much related to caloric efficiency, but rather to ensuring an adequate supply of essential nutrients. Protein and micronutrients are crucial for optimal health, while many of these essential nutrients are best obtained from animal source foods. Using CO2 equivalents per kilogram or per kilocalorie is therefore not a suitable basis for comparing foods with very different nutritional profiles. Applying such metrics in dietary scenarios to reduce climate impact may compromise micronutrient supply and promote strategies based on ultra-processed foods. In turn, this may negatively affect public health, which is already in bad shape and, as such, contribute further to carbon footprints, and substantially so. This type of commonly used diagrams, both in media and academia, clearly illustrate the problem of an overly simplistic use of metrics. If we would follow the logic of such graphs by comparing foods on a caloric basis, we would end up with a dietary argument for sugar, oils, and starchy staples. We should literally not compare apples and oranges, let alone wheat and beef, or beans and eggs. Metrics typically consist of a numerator, quantifying a certain impact, and a denominator, scaling for the amount of food or its value. Within the numerator, we already have a lot of complexity. When optimizing for emissions, we may induce trade-offs at other levels, for instance, by creating more water stress or biodiversity issues. The denominator complicates the picture even more. We can compare impact per unit of food expressed in kilogram if we wish to compare the same food for different production systems, but we cannot do so if we compare very different foods with different nutritional values. Even using calories or protein only offers a very limited perspective. Calories are usually not limiting in the food system except in the case of acute hunger situations. Moreover, protein needs are more a matter of essential amino acids and digestibility than of crude protein. And most importantly, what really limits nutrient adequacy in most cases is the availability of micronutrients, many of which are particularly present in foods from animal origin, as is the case for iron, zinc, iodine, calcium, vitamin B12, and so on. The question therefore becomes, Can the nutritional value of foods offset at least part of their impact on the environment? And the answer is clearly yes, as many studies have documented this in detail. Argument 6. When assessing animal production systems, the value of co-products should not be overlooked. A life cycle analysis usually does not fairly distribute emissions from services and byproducts of the animal industry, thus overstating the impact of foods. These relate to non-edible parts, such as hides, wool, bone, manure, as well as edible parts of the carcass, known as offal, which hold a very large part of the nutritional value. If these were to be factored in, carbon footprints of animal source foods would decrease. Yet, proper allocation methods are required to account for the various uses and markets of co-products, which can be a highly complex exercise. As an example, co-products of lamb account for 1/4 of total edible product by weight, and for 1/5 of total protein, 1/3 of total fat, and almost half of the total iron content. The liver contains more retinol, folic acid, and vitamin B12 than the carcass and other co-products combined. Argument 7. Calculations of livestock's climate impact should not only factor in carbon emissions, but also carbon sequestration. Grazing lands, which cover a vast portion of global land mass, are huge reservoirs of soil organic carbon. Adequate grassland management improves soil carbon stocks and may substantially offset emissions in regions where grazing lands dominate. Regenerative agriculture practices have shown impressive results in sequestering carbon and in enhancing soil fertility. Despite this potential, regenerative agriculture is often ignored in conventional assessments, among other reasons, due to debatable assumptions about carbon sequestration limitations and land requirements. However, there is a large amount of degraded grassland as well as arable land available, which presents an opportunity for long-term carbon sequestration. Where conditions allow it, some management systems lead to substantial carbon sequestration rates that can at least partially offset emissions. In Northern Ireland, a pioneering auditing program has shown the potential of improved soil and above-ground carbon stocks to lead to net zero emissions, some farms already being negative emitters. Similar promising results also come out of Australia and the United States. Such potential for net zero can be unlocked through a combination of better genetics and animal health, the use of multi-species swards and legumes, correcting soil pH, improved rotations, silvopastoralism, the planting of trees and hedgerows, and renewable energy use. Argument 8. Discussions on dietary emissions often refer to opportunity costs and carbon savings through rewilding and afforestation. However, these scenarios tend to not only underestimate the already mentioned role of grasslands as carbon sinks, but also the emissions associated with rewilding itself. Climate benefits of rewilding scenarios should not be overstated. They replace livestock with animals that are also methanogenic. Furthermore, the wild fauna can affect forest carbon sequestration through browsing. In many regions, current levels of livestock methane may not be all that different from natural baseline levels. Therefore, a balanced accounting of livestock's climatic impacts should discount such natural background emissions from those that are currently attributed to animal husbandry. A lot of the so-called anthropogenic emissions from livestock are not anthropogenic, properly speaking. In other words, they are not to be considered as a surplus due to human action and would be generated all the same if wild herbivores took over the ecological niche. In some areas, current livestock emissions are indeed above the natural baseline. However, in many others, they are well below. Such ecosystems would benefit from more grazing, not less. Argument 9. Protecting forests is a must. but a one-size-fits-all strategy of massive afforestation is irrelevant in open ecosystems that rely on grazing. Forests do not necessarily sequester more carbon than what is obtained with well-managed grasslands in temperate regions. They are more vulnerable to wildfire, take decades to be effective, and cause ecosystem harm in the case of ill-adapted tree monocultures. Grazing livestock can indeed sequester carbon at rates similar to afforestation, especially in grasslands where deeper layers of soil are crucial for carbon storage. Also, trees and livestock are not incompatible. Integrating agroforestry and discrete tree planting options within existing farm systems can increase woodland cover without displacing livestock, providing more resilience to fires and climate change while sequestering carbon effectively. Therefore, conversion of grasslands to forest lands does not necessarily lead to carbon gains, although this is of course dependent on the local context. Grazing livestock sequesters carbon at a similar rate of afforestation, but rates can also be higher. Moreover, assessment of the deeper layers is crucial when comparing forests and grasslands. Although carbon storage increases sharply in the top 30 centimeters of secondary forest soil, mainly due to surface litter, effects in grasslands also take place at deeper levels, below 1 meter, due to higher carbon input from roots. Although region-dependent, restoring grasslands can be more effective than afforestation, where soil depth and climate allow it. Whereas forests in temperate zones sequester 60 to 80 tons of carbon per hectare above ground and 100 tons below, grasslands are known to store up to 100 to 300 tons. Argument 10. Globally, methane is a potent greenhouse gas. It remains a challenge due to its production by various sources, including ruminants, but also rice farming, geological and fossil fuel emissions, wetlands and landfills. However, evaluating the impact of methane on global warming kinetics needs nuance. Using conventional CO2 equivalent accounting methods for methane to compare foods in the context of global warming can be misleading. Unlike CO2 from fossil fuels, which accumulates in the atmosphere, methane from ruminants is a short-lived pollutant within a biological cycle. It gets rapidly converted into CO2 in the atmosphere and then re-enters photosynthesis. As such, it adds no new carbon to the system. The caveat is that herd growth and productivity require careful mitigation because any increase in methane, for instance due to herd size expansion, would lead to rapid warming instead. Yet, mitigation of biogenic methane emissions from livestock is indeed feasible and can result in zero CO2 warming equivalent emissions or even cooling. Unfortunately, we do see a current acceleration in global methane. This may indeed be partially due to a relative increase in herd sizes in regions with low efficiency, but it could also be driven by various other causes, including higher fossil fuel emissions, especially from shale gas. Also, highly variable aquatic ecosystem sources may have been underaccounted for, including flooded rice paddies. Finally, it has been suggested that higher methane levels are due to weakening sinks, which are needed to neutralize the methane molecules, especially levels of hydroxyl radicals in the atmosphere. Slightly reducing the herd's methane emissions at a 0.3% rate per year would imply zero CO2 warming equivalent emissions. This would not cause further global warming at all in aggregate. Going beyond that may even induce cooling. A study from New Zealand estimated the carbon footprint of sheep meat and beef below 15 and 22 kg of CO2 equivalents per kilogram of meat, respectively, when taking into account sequestration and using conventional metrics, but found that sheep meat is climate neutral and beef is heading in that direction when using adapted metrics instead. So let's conclude this video. Yes, livestock contribute to global carbon emissions. Yet this contribution should not be taken out of context. The total emission impact of animal production has been estimated at 12%, but it needs to be well understood that this is not simply a number that one can just subtract from global carbon budgets when fully shifting to plant-based production systems. The reason is that these plant-based systems will generate their own emissions to compensate for the lost nutrition, which will indeed be substantial. A dietary shift will therefore generate savings much below 12%. Further complicating factors are that this 12% value mirrors the current state of affairs, while production is bound to become more efficient in the future, and also that co-products are not accounted for as they should, that the atmospheric kinetics of methane are complicated, that natural baselines are important, and that livestock farming not only emits but also sequesters carbon. References to the so-called opportunity costs related to rewilding or to afforestation are usually simplistic, as they overlook practical and ecological realities on the ground. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Please visit the Aleph 2020 website for much more information. Goodbye.